Today's seminar focuses on the resurgence of the Borneo states, regional power blocks, and the reshaping of Malaysia's centralized federal state relations. And our speaker is Dr. Arnold Puyuk, who's a visiting senior fellow with the Southeast Asia Center here, but his day job is as a senior lecturer at UNIMAS, University of Malaya in Malaysia Sarawak. But before introducing Arnold, Dr. Puyuk, properly, I should just mention a few things in the spirit of housekeeping and sort of promotional trailers. So first of all, today's seminar is online, so we have people participating from afar, and we will have an opportunity once Dr. Puyuk is finished speaking for questions and answers, in which we'd like to include questions for those of you joining us online via Zoom. So please, if you have questions, please put them in the Q&A function. We'll give you an example of how to do this, in which you give us your name, your affiliation, your location, and your question. We'll try and include you, time permitting. Today's event is being recorded, and you'll be able to find the recording for it on YouTube. We're also on social media, LinkedIn and Instagram in particular. So if you'd like to tag us, please do so at SEAC. I should also mention that we have some upcoming events of potential interest. Next Wednesday in the same time slot, 12 o'clock next week, Wednesday the 28th, we'll have a talk by Professor Judith Bovensiepen from Austria, from the University of Vienna, speaking about the politics of oil and gas in Timor-Leste. And then we'll also have the same day, that evening, a documentary film, Memories of Timor, Ingatan dari Timur, a documentary film that we'll show next Wednesday, the 28th at 5 p.m. And the following Wednesday, the 4th of February, we have a talk by Dr. Nicole Curato from the University of Birmingham, who'll be talking about beyond disinformation, toxic positivity as influence operations in the Philippines and Indonesia. And we have talks over subsequent Wednesdays, and we have another documentary film in March as well. So much to look forward to over the season ahead. But meanwhile, we have today our speaker, who is, as I mentioned earlier, Dr. Arnold Puyuk, a visiting senior fellow at the center here, and a senior lecturer in politics and government studies in the Faculty of Social Sciences and Humanities at the University of Malaysia Sarawak, or UNIMAS. His work examines political developments in the Borneo states of Sabah and Sarawak. He's from Sabah, but has been teaching and working, doing research in Sarawak. So he has a great comparative vantage point from understanding these two states. And he's paying particular attention to regionalism and ethnic politics as Malaysia has been entering this new phase of its political life since 2018, and we'll see the crucial role in his talk today of these two Borneo states of Sabah and Sarawak in this process. His recent publications include Autonomy in Sarawak and Sabah, Different Paths and Diverging Outcomes, published by the Institute for Southeast Asian Studies in 2024. And then last year, The Ethnic Factor in Sabah Politics, Competing Loyalties, Coalitional Strategies, and Electoral Volatility, published in 2025 by the Institute for Southeast Asian Studies. He also co-edited a volume on Sarawak, the electoral dynamics in Sarawak, with Meredith Weiss, who's a special friend to the center, and he's worked closely with her and with other specialists on Sabah and Sarawak of note in his work. But he's here to tell you about recent developments and trends, having returned home and observed the elections. So we're looking forward to hearing what he has to tell us. Many thanks for joining us, Dr. Puyuk.
Yes.
You see the slide changing?
Maybe, but sure. Yeah, it's working now, so it was probably just for some.
Thank you very much for that kind introduction, John. And a very good morning to everyone in this room, and also those who are following us outside. As John mentioned, I'm currently the visiting senior fellow at the center and a senior lecturer in politics and government studies at the Faculty of Social Sciences at UNIMAS. So basically, this is part of my ongoing work, looking at the recent political developments in Sabah and Sarawak. I'm not too sure how many of you have been to Sabah and Sarawak before, because if people tell you about Malaysia, normally the focus will be on Peninsular Malaysia, and the focus will be on the three largest ethnic groups there: the Malays, the Chinese, or the Indians. And in fact, if people talk about the political development in Malaysia, normally the issues revolve around the contestation for power between these three main ethnic groups. So what I'm going to share with you today is that this perception has changed substantially, especially after 2008, because again, if people look at Malaysia, people look at it as a stable and centralized federation. That's number one. And the very mention of Sabah and Sarawak, people will think Sabah and Sarawak as peripheral states, states that do not contribute meaningfully to the development of Malaysian politics. And in fact, if you look at in terms of the geographical distance between Peninsular Malaysia and Sabah and Sarawak, that basically reinforces this political neglect. And again, when people look at Sabah and Sarawak, they say that Sabah and Sarawak are culturally unique, religiously unique as well, but politically and socio-economically, they are not as advanced as Peninsular Malaysia. So this has been the perception before 2008. So I'm here today to provide with you some different perspective on how we should look at the Borneo states. Because I would argue that the Borneo states are no longer just peripheral states, making symbolic demands, like what people often think. The Borneo states are becoming regional power centers capable of reshaping Malaysia's long centralized federal state relations. I will show you how they do this. But then again, the interesting thing to see here is that both Sabah and Sarawak do this so unevenly. It's more advanced in Sarawak, but less so in Sabah. And understanding why tells us something important, not just about Malaysia, but about how federal system actually work. Even though I look at Malaysian politics and Sabah and Sarawak politics in general, but I situate my study within the framework of federalism, territorial autonomy, and the debates around the issue of regionalism. So at first glance, one might assume that all Malaysian states share a broadly similar historical trajectory, as they were all once colonized by the British. But this assumption is misleading. The history of colonization in Sabah and Sarawak was markedly different from that of Peninsular Malaysia. You look at Sarawak, for instance, even though we were all under the British colonization before, but Sabah and Sarawak did not share Malaya's pre-1957 history. And as we all know, Sarawak was ruled by the Brooke dynasty for over a century. And Sabah was governed through a chartered company rule. And because of this distinct historical trajectory and different colonization period that all these different territories went through, that basically shaped the way politics is being expressed in these different territories. That's number one. And in terms of historical trajectory, under the colonialism, under British colonial period. And if you look at in terms of the geographical background of both the Borneo states, the Borneo states cover roughly 60% of Malaysia's landmass. Peninsular Malaysia accounts for about 40%. And socially and demographically, the Borneo states are even more distinctive because together they are home to more than 80 ethnic groups, comprising over 200 sub-ethnic groups, each differentiated by language, dialect, customs, and historical experience. When people look at Malaysia, normally, as I mentioned to you earlier, the focus will be on the three main ethnic groups only, the Malays, the Chinese, or the Indians. But if you go to the Borneo states, there are more than 80 ethnic groups there, and 200 sub-ethnic groups with different languages, dialects, custom, and even historical experience. So unlike Peninsular Malaysia, again, this is a very important point for us to look into. There is no single dominant ethnic group in either state. And this demographic reality has important political consequences. Ethnicity in the Borneo states tends to be plural, localized, overlapping, rather than consolidated into a single dominant category, like what we see in Peninsular Malaysia. So as a result, politics in the Borneo states is less easily structured around majoritarian ethnic appeals and more dependent on coalition building, negotiation, and accommodation across multiple communities. Religion is another important thing that we have to look into. Even though Islam is the dominant religion in Peninsular Malaysia, but in the Borneo states, religious identity is more fluid. In Sabah, Christianity remains politically significant, even though Islam is the biggest religion in Sabah. But previously, before 1970s, Sabah had no official religion, but only after 1970s, Sabah had an official religion, which is Islam. But then again, Christianity remains politically significant. In Sarawak, the majority is Christian, and inter-ethnic marriage blurs religious boundaries because it seems like in the Borneo states, religious identity does not matter. What matters is ethnic identity, the people's cultural distinctiveness. If, for instance, you go to Sabah, you meet a Dusun Muslim, they would probably say that they are Dusun first, then Muslim second. If you go to Sarawak, for instance, you meet with the Iban or the Kayan or the Kanya, they would say they are the Kayan, Iban, or Kanya first, then Islam. It's the same thing if you go to the Borneo states, they would not say that they are Malaysian first. They are either Sabahan or Sarawakan first, then Malaysians. So these are the things that are interesting if you want to see the rise of the Borneo states in the context of Malaysia's evolving politics. Now, so taken together, the Borneo states entered Malaysia in 1963 with a fundamentally different historical and social logic from the states of the peninsula. And this is precisely why the question posed by today's talk, which is the resurgence of the Borneo states as regional power blocks, cannot be understood simply as routine state federal tension. What we are witnessing is not just political dissatisfaction. It is the reassertion of regions that were historically, socially, and institutionally distinct from the very beginning. And that we are now seeking to renegotiate their place within a federation that has long treated them as peripherals. This background brings us directly to the significance of the Malaysian Agreement 1963, or MS63 as it is popularly known in Malaysia, which I will turn to next. Now, MS63 is a very popular issue in the Borneo states. It's a popular issue in the election. People always talk about MS63, but after 2008, people in Peninsular Malaysia have been exposed to MS63 in varying degrees. I will talk about it later. Let me begin with some essential background. Malaysia is a federation, yes, but it is not the one that emerged through bottom-up unification in the way that the US or Switzerland did. In the US or Switzerland, previously autonomous political units came together to create a new central authority. That's in the US or in Switzerland. But I would argue that Malaysia did not emerge from that kind of process. Although the Borneo states had distinct political history of their own, the federation that emerged in 1963 was not created by equal sovereign units negotiating a new center from scratch. I can expect that this statement will not go down well with some people in Sabah and Sarawak, because they say that the Borneo states formed Malaysia together as equal partners. But in my understanding, in my reading, is that that is not the case, which I will explain further later. Now, by the time Malaysia was formed, Malaya had already existed as an independent and strongly centralized state since 1957. With its constitutional framework, political institutions, and ruling elite firmly in place. That's the difference, number one. So the Borneo states were therefore incorporated into an existing state framework rather than co-founding a new one on equal institutional footing. So in this case, they were coming together not as an equal partner, because you have one already a centralized state, which is the Federation of Malaysia or Malaya. Then you have Sabah and Sarawak. At that time, were self-governing territories, but did not have that political and institutional capacity, like the Federation of Malaysia in 1957. So, in comparative terms, Malaysia, I would say, is best described as what is called as a holding together federation. This is not my concept. This is a concept associated with Alfred Stepan, a system in which devolution of power is introduced to manage diversity and territorial integration, but where the center retains strong structural advantages from the outset. So I would say, rather than coming together federation, like what people think Malaysia is, I would argue that Malaysia is a holding together federation, borrowing from Stepan's concept. So Malaysia was not formed in 1963. Sorry, Malaysia was formed in 1963, not 1957. So when the Borneo states joined Malaya, the arrangement was governed by what is commonly known as the Malaysia Agreement 1963, involving Malaysia, UK, Federation of Malaya, the Borneo states, and Singapore. But interestingly, less than 2 years, Singapore left the Federation. Some describe this as a separation, right? Others as an expulsion. Depends on how you look at it. But there is one book recently published. The title of the book is The Albatross File, saying that it is neither separation nor expulsion. It's a mutual agreement between Malaysia and Singapore that Singapore should eventually leave the federation. It's a very interesting book. There is also a documentary on this shown on YouTube. Now, NU63 promised substantial autonomy to Sabah and Sarawak, including control over immigration and land. I think my friend Dr. Ayuni knows about this. If we go to Sarawak, we want to work in Sarawak, we have to apply for a work permit. Right? So if you do not want to work in Sarawak, you still need to go to the immigration counter and they will give you a social pass. So you are allowed to remain in Sarawak not more than 90 days, right? 90 days or 60 days. So this is interesting. You are in the same federation, but when you go to Sabah and Sarawak, suddenly you feel like you are in a different country, right? So substantial autonomy, control over immigration and land, safeguards over religion, education, language, and fiscal matters. Crucially, the Borneo states were not framed as ordinary constituent states, but as founding partners in a new federation. So this is where the concept of founding partners comes into the picture, because a lot of people refer to the Cobalt Commission report, 1962, which emphasized that the Borneo states were joining Malaysia as equal partners, not simply merging into the existing federation of Malaya. Now, increasingly, Malaysia became centralized, and this was particularly evident under the rule of Mahathir Mohamad 1.0, not Mahathir Mohamad 2.0, because he became a prime minister twice. For the ruling coalition, the Barisan Nasional, which Mahathir ruled, in which Mahathir was the chairman at that time, for them, maintaining a two-thirds majority, parliamentary majority was politically crucial, and this translated into a strong grip over constitutional change, federal institutions, and state-level governance, especially in the Borneo states. So federal powers expanded through constitutional amendments, fiscal dominance, and the penetration of national parties into state politics, as what we see in Sabah in 1991. That was the first attempt by the national party UMNO to go into state politics, and they were quite successful. So since then, UMNO has maintained its presence in Sabah, even though politically it's weak, but the presence of national-based parties can still be felt in Sabah as compared to Sarawak, in which there are no national parties there. It is controlled by local-based party. So some leaders in Sabah and Sarawak, they challenge this centralizing tendency of the federal government, but when they did that, they were either politically marginalized and in certain cases face legal consequences, which I don't want to delve into because there's a lot of studies done on this before. Over time, autonomy guarantees were gradually hollowed out, not always formally abolished, but rendered politically weak. A major shift occurred in 2008. Again, if we look at Malaysian political history, there was a big shift in 2008 because in the first time in our history, BN lost its two-thirds majority. Because for Mahathir, when you go to the election, you have to win with a two-thirds majority. But that did not happen in 2008. As you can see on the diagram over there, there's a lot of opposition parties on the other side in Peninsular Malaysia, but in Sabah and Sarawak, BN reigned supreme. So in a way, the Borneo states helped the federal government, the BN at the federal level, to survive the election. They did not lose power, they were only politically weakened. But that was as a result of the seats, parliamentary seats contributed by the Borneo states. Because without the Borneo states, BN would have lost power at the federal level. So Borneo states, since then, have no longer functioned as so-called fixed deposit states. That's what we are called before, fixed deposit states. It's like when you want to invest in a bank, right? When the interest rate is good, then you put your money there. So a lot of people in Sabah and Sarawak don't like this fixed deposits term. So from being fixed deposit states, Sabah and Sarawak, the Borneo states, have now become kingmakers in federal politics. For many in the Borneo states, this period marked not revenge or rupture, but an opportunity for political rebalancing. It was a chance to renegotiate their place within the federation. So if you look at MS 63 today, it operates less as a legal document than as a political language. It has become a symbol of a broken bargain and a rallying point for renewed regional assertion. And this leads me to a crucial analytical point. What we are observing in the Borneo states today is not a rediscovery of the constitution, I would say, but a renegotiation of federal power. Now, this brings me to the first theoretical bridge, which I will keep deliberately simple. So if you see across federations, scholars such as William H. Riker, it's a very popular name, and Alfred Stepan have shown that federalism should not be understood as a stable equilibrium guaranteed by constitutional design. Instead, federalism operates as a continuous political bargain. But by bargain here, they do not mean a single founding contract. When they mean bargain, they mean an ongoing process of multiple overlapping negotiations that evolve over time. These negotiations involve not only governments, but also parties, coalitions, and political elites operating at different levels of the system. But this does not mean that rules do not matter. Rules still matter, including constitutional provision, as well as official agreement between federal and state governments. But the Malaysian case illustrates an important point, which is this. Constitutional rules often matter less than negotiated arrangement because what ultimately shapes autonomy is not legal text alone, but political enforcement. This is what I see in the context of Malaysian federalism. So, in practice, the outcomes of these formal rules depend on three key factors. Number one, who controls political parties? Number two, who controls resources? And the last one is who the center needs in order to govern. So if you look at the whole framework this way, what we see is that federalism is less about what is written on paper and more about where political leverage lies at any given point. And this perspective helps us to move away from asking, what does Malaysia say, and towards a more analytically useful question, who can enforce its meaning today? So, with that in mind, let me turn to Sarawak. So if you look at Sarawak, again, for those people who never been to Sarawak, they look at Sarawak as culturally unique, very, very tolerant society. And people argue that this attributes to Sarawak's position as a strong regional unity. But this is only one factor. Another factor is what I call as political insulation. I'll explain later what I mean by that. Because GPS has been in power since 2018, right? So they left Barisan Nasional and they formed a new coalition called Gabungan Parti Sarawak. In fact, these are all the same people who were in Barisan Nasional before. No new people, no new leaders. Perhaps there are some, but there are not many. The same elites, they just changed their clothes. From Barisan Nasional, it's like from Barisan Nasional to GBA. It's like you are changing your football jersey from Liverpool to Manchester United. If you are into football. Now, but then again, this is only one factor. I would argue that the stronger argument would be political insulation. What do I mean by political insulation? Political insulation is a situation in which a regional political system is able to consolidate authority locally by limiting external party penetration, controlling the dominant political narrative, and keeping key local actors within a shared coalition framework. So this is precisely what GPS is doing in Sarawak. What they did was, they said, no national-based parties in Sarawak. Even though UMNO wanted to go in, they said no UMNO. Right? And people in Sarawak, especially the opposition, say, even though we don't have UMNO, we have UMNO, but in a Sarawak form. That is Gabungan Parti Sarawak. So, but when they did that, they were able to basically exclude national politics, national political arena from state politics. And there seems to be a very clear boundary between state and federal politics. One thing that GPS did was that they controlled the local narrative, Sarawak first. They did not allow the opposition to basically ride on this. It was the ruling state government who said that only the ruling state government, only the local-based party can realize this Sarawak first sentiment in Sarawak. So what did Sarawak do? They were able to negotiate with the federal government because they were politically strong. So what they did was, I think there were a lot of things that they do. They managed to translate into some practical policy outcomes, but I would only share some of the major things that GPS managed to translate into policy outcomes. Number one, there was greater recognition of its authority in the oil and gas sector. One outcome was the acceptance of Petros as gas aggregator, a role that was held by Petronas before. This helped Sarawak to reduce its dependence on Petronas. Petronas is the national oil and gas company, even though ownership, legally speaking, is still with Petronas. But in terms of managing the oil and gas industry in Sarawak, it is now under Petros. They were able to impose 5% sales tax on petroleum produced in the state. They were even granted administrative decentralization in education. And perhaps the most symbolically, the constitutional restoration of MS-63, because the person who tabled this was a leader from GPS. When it was tabled, it was passed. And for the Borneo state, this was a big victory. Because for the first time in history, since 1970s, MS-63 was included in the federal constitution as a founding document that formed Malaysia. Whereas it was not included before, but now it was included. Not only that, after the amendment, Sabah and Sarawak were now known as the Borneo states. That's why I prefer to use Borneo states rather than Sabah and Sarawak, because it's already written in the constitution very clearly. So when you define the Federation of Malaysia, the Federation of Malaysia consists of 11 states in the Peninsular Malaysia. That's in paragraph A, and B, the Borneo states of Sabah and Sarawak. Whereas before, we were all lumped together as states in the Federation of Malaysia. And this did not basically make people in Sabah and Sarawak happy, because they say we are not the same as the 11 states in Peninsular Malaysia. So that's how it is seen. Now we look at Sarawak. So what happened is that autonomy in Sarawak has been incremental, negotiated, and pragmatic. It has not been pursued through constitutional rupture or confrontational politics, but through sustained bargaining enabled by political unity and the centre's reliance on regional support. In Sabah, it's different. Sabah presents a stark contrast to Sarawak, because political system is highly fragmented in Sabah. There were frequent government change, if I'm not mistaken, more than 6 times since the formation of Malaysia in 1963. As I mentioned earlier, UMNO managed to go into state politics in 1991. So what we see in Sabah is a very fragmented, volatile, and deeply penetrated by federal parties. So I would say that in the context of Sabah, it is not that Sabah does not have a strategy in terms of how they want to translate autonomy gains into policy outcomes. It's not strategy alone. For me, it is the structure of its politics. Number one, Sabah's constraints is not the absence of regionally oriented leaders, but the absence of a stable party system capable of sustaining collective bargaining across electoral cycles. Number two, Sabah's elites operate in a political environment where loyalty to federal coalitions often yields more immediate rewards than sustained state-level coordination. And third, Sabah lacks a gatekeeping mechanism to protect its political arena. Without political insulation, it negotiates with the center as a multiple competing actors rather than a single bloc weakening its bargaining position. So if you go to Sabah, a lot of people are talking about Sabah first, fighting for Malaya, not only one person, but there are multiple actors, different actors with different strategies, talking about MS-63, talking about how they want to get autonomy and power back. So this caused, or this rather weakened Sabah's bargaining position. And finally, Sabah's fiscal dependence on federal transfers further limits its leverage, especially when compared with Sarawak's stronger resource base and greater administrative control, making Sabah's autonomy demands easier for the center to manage. If you look at Sabah, for instance, in the recent election, the ruling coalition won the election, but they only won with 29 seats, as opposed to Abdal Warisan from the opposition that won 25 seats. It was a very marginal win. They didn't manage to get more than 30 seats in order to be the majority position. So they had to form a coalition, including a coalition consisting of national-based parties like BN and Pakatan Harapan. Whereas in Sarawak, the configuration is different. It's only local-based parties without national-based parties in the coalition. So at this point, it is important for us to step back and clarify what kind of politics we are actually observing in the Borneo states. What we are seeing is, I would argue, what we are seeing is neither ethnic mobilization in the classic sense, no separatism. Because people from outside think this is ethnic mobilization, this is ethnic problem. Sabah and Sarawak are going to separate from the federation. But I do not think that would be the case. In its classic form, ethnic mobilization refers to politics organized around a single dominant ethnic group with clearly defined in-group and out-group boundaries. But we don't have that in the Borneo states, where political claims are justified primarily through ethnicity, language, or religion. Separatism, by contrast, involves an explicit or implicit goal of exit from the state, whether in the form of sovereignty, independence, or external self-determination. But then again, in the context of the Borneo states, I do not think this is something that the leaders in the Borneo states want to pursue. So again, I would like to emphasize that the objective is not sovereignty, but renegotiation. This is where insights from Michael Keating are particularly useful. Michael Keating is a scholar studying regionalism in Europe. So Michael Keating reminds us that modern regionalism is less about leaving the state or more about rescaling power. What does he mean by rescaling power? Is that political authority is not simply shifted upward, but to the center or downward to the regions. Rather, political authority is rearranged across multiple territorial levels. So in this case, power becomes redistributed, layered, and continuously negotiated across local, regional, national, and sometimes supranational arenas. So, a final theoretical insight concerns the central government's reliance on subnational actors. In fragmented parliamentary system, central governments often depend on subnational actors for political survival. When this happens, regions are no longer treated merely as administrative units. They are transformed into coalition partners whose support becomes essential to governing. And this dynamic is not unique to Malaysia. For instance, if you look at Spain, national governments have frequently governed in minority, with regional parties, particularly from Catalonia and the Basque country, playing a decisive role in sustaining both left and right-wing administration. As Bonifield shows, their influence derives less from constitutional authority than from coalition and multi-level bargaining under minority rule. And this framework helps explain Sarawak's post-2018 experience. What we see at that moment was that the federal coalition became fragile. Sarawak's MPs became indispensable to government formation and survival. And Sarawak was able to convert federal dependence into concrete bargaining leverage. In Sabah, by contrast, Sabah remained constrained by internal fragmentation and was far less able to do the same. It also helps us understand why autonomy gains may stall if federal stability returns. So the question here is, will federal stability returns in Malaysia, and then will this affect the autonomy demands of the Borneo states? I would say the restoration of federal stability, in my view, is unlikely. Perhaps somebody in this room or anyone outside do not agree with me. But even as stability returns, I would say it will not be, it is likely to be shallow and conditional rather than consolidated. Autonomy in this sense has to be continually negotiated. It is no permanent or guaranteed. Now, let me conclude with 3 reflections. First, Sarawak demonstrates that meaningful autonomy is possible within Malaysia's federation, but only under specific political conditions. What are the conditions? Number one, a cohesive and locally dominant party system, political insulation from national parties, and the ability to act as a unified bargaining bloc, including the centre's reliance on regional actors as a result of unstable central government. That's number one. Second, Sabah illustrates the limits of autonomy discourse without political consolidation. Strong public sentiment and Sabah first rhetoric have not translated into bargaining power because political fragmentation, party volatility, and federal interference prevent the state from acting as a unified political actor. And third, this is a very important point that I would like to emphasize. Malaysia's federal system is not being dismantled, even though Johor is also trying to get more autonomy. Penang is also the same thing, and other states in the East Coast like Kelantan and Terengganu are beginning to say that more oil should be given to them. But I would argue that Malaysia's federal system, as for now, is not being dismantled. It is being quietly renegotiated. This renegotiation is moving towards greater asymmetry, selective decentralization, and pragmatic bargaining. Whether this leads to a more balanced federation or simply a new form of managed centralism remains an open question. Perhaps another different topic for me to present in the next seminar. So, and that I think is where the Borneo states matter, not just to Malaysia, but to comparative federalism more broadly. Because the Borneo states, the cases that I have just presented, show that meaningful autonomy is not determined by constitutional design alone, nor driven necessarily by ethnic mobilization or separatism. Instead, autonomy emerges under specific political conditions. Again, like I said earlier, cohesive territorial party system, political insulation, and the center's reliance on regional groups or actors. By comparing Sabah and Sarawak, what I have highlighted is that some regions, I have explained, some regions can convert autonomy discourse into bargaining power, while others cannot. In doing so, I offer a framework, I hope, that travels well beyond Malaysia. So thank you very much. I look forward to your question.
Many thanks for that great talk.
Thanks.
Super interesting, leaving lots of questions. Do you want to take them yourself? Or should I field them for you?
Yeah, can do that.
Okay. Any questions from the audience? Do introduce yourself.
My name is Tiffany. I'm a PhD student at the government department here. I was just wondering how much you thought Singapore's exit undermined Sabah and Sarawak's place in the federation.
Should I take it now or forget to post?
Yeah.
Any question? Follow-up question before I answer them one by one?
Another in the back.
Yeah.
My name is Therapy, and also a senior fellow here. So during the democratization period I'm from Burma, Myanmar, a lot of politicians and also regional leaders were sent to Indonesia for, like emulation or, to study the successful transition of power from the military to the civilian government. But after you talk, I'm ignorant of Malaysian politics, but do you know why the Malaysian federated model and also the negotiations between the Borneo states and the central state have not been or shared with other regional partners? Why Malaysia did not become a kind of like a case study or, because not right now, the federalism is the key theme or the kind of one of the bigger, broader goals of the revolution right now, but very few people know about, Malaysia. So if I'm wondering if you have insights on why it is the case, why Indonesia and not Malaysia.
Okay, on Singapore, yes. If you go to Sabah or Sarawak, what they hoped to see at that time was that before Singapore left, at least what Singapore would have done was to discuss with Sarawakian and Sabahan leaders. But a lot of people in Sabah and Sarawak say that they were not consulted. Right? Singapore left without consulting Sabah and Sarawak. So even until today, many people in Sabah and Sarawak, they are not happy about that. And now when they see Singapore as a prosperous country, advanced, very independent, and Sabah and Sarawak can say, look, if we were not part of Malaysia, we could have been like Singapore. That is the main argument, even though not only Singapore, they look at Brunei, they look at one indicator, that is economic development, high income. That's why people in Sabah and Sarawak, they want to be like Brunei or Singapore. But they forget one thing, that when Singapore was not part of Malaysia, then the leaders were really doing what they could in order to make Singapore independent, make the government efficient, and to ensure that they could deliver. So the question that I normally pose to our leaders in Sabah and Sarawak is that when we are independent like Singapore, are we able to deliver efficiently? Do we have good leaders? Leaders who are not corrupt, right? So if you look at Sabah at the moment, Sabah is being set with corruption allegations, including the leaders. And some of the leaders are appointed to be in our cabinet now. And we know this corruption happening before, but we never see it on the video. We only hear this from the politician. But now, it is shown on the video. We see what they are doing. So again, the question is, if you are independent, would you be able to be like Singapore? I would not say that Singapore is 100% clean, but at least the idea that they want to make a country that is free of corruption, efficient in terms of the delivery, accountability. If we can do that, perhaps the question is, Sabah is ready to be an independent country. So I think that's the whole idea that is given by many people in Sabah or in Sarawak. But interestingly, not many political leaders in Sabah and Sarawak are ready for separation. In fact, if you go to Sarawak, if you sing the Sarawak state anthem, it says there, Sarawak dalam Malaysia. It says that Sarawak is within Malaysia. That is in the state anthem. Right? So Sarawak is playing what is called as a moderating role, to not to exit. The elites is playing a moderating role, not to exit from the federation. So in Sabah, the same idea is being given to Sabahan, that exit is not the solution. It's a renegotiation. In fact, when I interview many of the leaders in Sarawak, I often pose this question to them: do you want to exit or not? Point blank. But they say, no, we do not want to exit. We want executive power. We want to decide things on our own. And exit is not the solution. That's what they said to me. Okay. But whether or not in the future Sabah and Sarawak would leave the federation, I leave it to the younger generation, like the lady there from Sarawak. If you want to leave, then it's up to you, right? Yeah, but at least in my lifetime, I would not think that we are ready to leave the federation. But we are ready to negotiate. what's best for us based on MS63. Now that MS63 is already in the constitution, we can always say that, look, it's already there. Now it's a matter of implementing it. So now what happened is that Anwar Ibrahim is under a lot of pressure in terms of whether or not the federal government will pay us the 40% federal revenue. So the court says that the federal government should pay 40% since 1970s. Can you imagine? 40%, that's billions of ringgit. But the federal government says that they abide by the court's decision, but they disagree with some of the wording of the judges. So they are going to appeal for that, but they're not going to appeal for the decision on the 40%. So Anwar is like, in a lot of stress. How is he going to deal with this? And in terms of oil and gas ownership is still with the federal government, but Sabah and Sarawak wants to have more. They want to have more ownership. But I don't think the federal government is willing to do that, because that's going to affect the federal government's federal coffers, federal financial coffers. So in terms of Malaysia as a case study, I remember when I went to the Philippines, I have a discussion with the academics there. They said that, yeah, we think we should look at Malaysia. It's time for the Philippines to adopt a federal system. That's what they say, John. Some of the academics in our discussion. But I would not say that you should. No, but of course there are defects in the federal system, like what you see in Malaysia now. Centralizing tendency of the federal government, which is now the states are trying to deal with. Well, I only look at Spain and to a certain extent Scotland, but mostly Spain, because these are the emergent federations. I don't look at Myanmar at the moment. Perhaps we can do a comparative study to see whether the framework that I'm looking at fits into Myanmar's model. Because I only look at Sabah and Sarawak and Spain to a certain extent. I think, as I mentioned earlier, it can travel beyond Malaysia, but I don't know about Myanmar. Maybe I'm wrong or maybe I'm right. Yeah. But for comparative perspective, why not? Yeah, let's look into that.
So there's some questions
yeah.
online.
Bring them up on the screen. You?
I read a question from you. Okay. Okay. Yes, I agree with Jayum that in terms of parliamentary, I call it parliamentary arithmetic, that the federal still has the leverage because they hold more seats than Sabah and Sarawak. But when I say resurgence of the Borneo states, I do not look at it in terms of parliamentary arithmetic alone. I'm looking at it from the perspective of how the Borneo states helped shape coalition bargaining at the federal level, and how they helped shape the narrative, the idea of MS63. The Agong recently said that, he did not say specifically MS63, but he said that we should look back at our history, we should maintain the uniqueness of this country that we call as Malaysia. And then people in Sabah and Sarawak, they say that, okay, that is MS63 because Malaysia as a country was formed only in 1963, right? So then again, the idea is that where should nation building begin? Should it begin in 1957 or should it begin in 1963? But the people in Sabah and Sarawak, they say Malaysia in 1963. Nation building should be built up properly or gradually from there. But for people in Peninsular Malaysia, they say where we look at 1957, 31st of August 1957. But then again, this narrative is already becoming very mainstream. MS-63 is already mainstream. They talk about it in parliament. Some people in Peninsular Malaysia are also talking about it. So I look at Resurgence from that perspective in terms of challenging the old narrative of Malaysia's national building idea or process, and also in terms of coalition bargaining. The question by Sazali, to what extent does ASEAN, okay. I think this is very much related to what I call as rescaling just now by Michael Keating. But it's just that when Michael Keating talks about rescaling of federal power, he only show how it is done, but he does not show whether or not this rescaling of power succeeded or not. But in my case, I show that the rescaling of power at this time succeeds, because if you look at Sarawak, Sarawak is already looking beyond Malaysia as a territory. They are dealing with Singapore, they are dealing with Indonesia on their own in terms of exporting energy to Kalimantan, to Indonesia, or even to Singapore. So I think in the broader ASEAN framework, Sarawak is already moving beyond Malaysia. And I think Sabah will be following Sarawak's footsteps soon. If we look at it from the wider perspective of ASEAN. Okay, there's one more from Ida. Okay, I'm curious to know. Okay. Okay. I think for Sarawak, their strategy is simple. Whoever is in power at the federal level, the Sarawak government will support. Even if Mufakat Nasional is in power, consisting of Bersatu or even PAS, I think Sarawak would not mind to be part of the coalition. Because some people say that if PAS is in the coalition, Sabah and Sarawak should not be part of it, because PAS's idea of PAS's Islamic idea is not compatible with Sabah and Sarawak. But then again, that's not how Sabah and Sarawakians political elites operate. Because they can always say that, yes, we are in this coalition together at the federal level, but when we are in Sabah and Sarawak, we operate on our own, detaching ourselves from federal politics. And for your information, in Sarawak, we have one member of parliament from Bersatu. And in Sabah, we have one state assemblyman from PAS.
For the first time.
For the first time in our history. After what? After how many years?
50 years.
50 years, the first time. Even though some people argue that it is not PAS that people supported, but that personality, that individual. But whatever it is, PAS is already there in Sabah. Yeah. Yes.
I have a question, sort of maybe it's our last question. You mentioned on several occasions and gave some illustrations of how Sabah and Sarawak differ in their capacity to make good use of the sort of increasing pluralism, competitiveness, and democratic quality of politics in Malaysia today. And the difference, as you explained it, is that in Sabah, you have much greater political fragmentation and fluidity compared to a more consolidated, entrenched political coalition in a machine-like fashion in Sarawak. And I'm curious, what's the explanation for that difference? Is I assume that there are theories that it has to do with different ethnic constellations. There might be institutional, historical differences. There might be differences of the kind of politics, including left-wing politics that you had in Sarawak in the 60s. But you also alluded to a difference in terms of the much stronger fiscal base, resource base that Sarawak has as opposed to Sabah, which is more dependent on revenues from Kuala Lumpur. Is there an economic explanation, an economistic explanation for this difference? What is your view on the underlying structural roots of this divergence?
Yeah, that's a very good question. There are many factors. One of it is what is called as institutionalization, and how power is being institutionalized into the system. And it seems like Sarawak is able to do that. Because if you look at the history of Sarawak, they started from James Brooke for more than 100 years. And the Brooke family managed to institutionalize governance into the system for a very long time. In fact, if not mistaken, Sarawak has the earliest federal state cabinet in the whole of Malaysia. They call it Council Negeri. Yeah, if not mistaken. Somebody can correct me if I'm wrong. That's number one. Because of this, the leaders that came later, they just followed through because the institutions were already there. It was already set up nicely for them. They're only there to just make sure that this institution could follow through. That's number one. Number two, I would say the ability of the state political elites to dominate the local narrative around Sarawak first. Because you see a lot of people are also talking about Sarawak first, including the opposition, but the political elites were very fast to ride on it, to grab the opportunity to institutionalize this narrative. And they were able to deliver tangible and programmatic policy outcomes for the people to see. So this helped consolidate local power around DBS. I think that is one of the explanations. I think for Sabah, as I mentioned to you earlier, Sabah did not have that kind of institutionalization. Sabah's history, politics, and economy was very fragmented. So institutionalization only came later in 1963, whereas Sarawak, it happened before. In Sabah, it only came in 1963. In fact, the word autonomy, the debate around autonomy, I would say, only became popular in Sabah after 1963. People started to talk about it. Yeah. So I think that's the amount of factors I could think of. Yeah.
Well, many thanks for a super interesting talk and for your very clear and convincing responses to a range of questions. So please join me in thanking Dr. Poyuk.